All right, looking at the first problem, we are going to take and place it into standard form first. So we're going to take that positive 39, move it from the right side to the left side, make it a negative 39. I should then see that what I have is a trinomial that is a quadratic where a is equal to 1. And so I'm thinking what two numbers multiply to a negative 39? That means one has to be positive, one has to be negative, and add to a 10. It's positive 10. So I'm thinking this is going to be a positive 13 and a negative 3. That will give us our factors. But remember, we're solving, so we're wanting to find our intercepts, the place where this parabola crosses over the x-axis. That is going to occur at negative 13, 0, and at 3, 0. The second problem, we should recognize that this is already set up to do the square root method. So if we have x squared equals 169, we're going to square root both sides. Make sure that we put a plus or minus in there. The square root of 169 is 13. That tells us that this crosses at the point 13, 0 and the point negative 13, 0. Number 3 is also one that is a square root problem. We can see by the form of it. So I'm going to start by isolating the square by taking the positive 4 and subtracting 4 from both sides. And then remember, we cannot distribute into parentheses that have an exponent. So I'm going to take and divide both sides by 3. And now we're ready to square root both sides. Remember, this is where we put our plus or minus in there, getting those two answers. And then I'm going to take this negative 5, move it over to the other side to become a positive 5, plus or minus the square root of 2. That is our radical answer. We want to go to the decimal, so I'm now going to go to my calculator and do 5 plus the square root of 2. And that is going to give me that there's an intercept at 6.41. Remember, I'm rounding to 2 decimal places unless I'm told otherwise. Looking at the third decimal place and rounding the second appropriately. And then my next one is going to be 3.59. All right, so the next one I should see that it is missing that middle term or linear term, and so therefore this problem is a square root method also. And so I'm going to subtract 30 from both sides because I'm isolating the square, and then I'm going to divide by 8. I have the square isolated, so I'm going to square root both sides. Make sure that you put the plus or minus there, and then go to your calculator, and we'll need to do the square root of 3, and that'll give us 1.73. And so that'll tell us there's an intercept at 1.730 and an intercept at negative 1.730. If I look at this problem, I can't do the square root method because it has an x term. So I start to look for factoring, and I do notice that there is a GCF here, and that GCF is an x. So I'm going to factor out an x. That'll leave me with x minus 10 in the parentheses. And so when I factor this, I can see that right here, this is going to give me an intercept or a solution at the origin, and when I set this equal to 0 and solve, my other intercept is going to be at 10, 0. All right, so looking at the next one here, we have some choices. We might look at this, if we're talking about our 3 methods, we've got factoring, we've got square root, and we've got quadratic formula. If you look at this, we cannot, because of this 8x, we cannot do the square root method, so that's out. So you have a choice whether you're going to go factor and see if it works, or go to quadratic formula immediately. If you factor, you would have to start with a GCF of 2, and then that would leave us with x squared minus 4x minus 10. And you kind of run into a roadblock here because we don't have two numbers that multiply to a negative 2 that add to a negative 4. So factoring doesn't work, and so quadratic formula is our only option here. So we first have to identify our A, B, and C. So our A value is 2, our B value is negative 8, our C value is negative 20. We're then going to calculate the discriminant. That discriminant is going to tell us the number of solutions that we're looking for. So I'm typing into my calculator that this will be negative 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times a negative 20. And I get 224. And that positive number, since this is positive, it tells me keep going, that there are two solutions. And I now need to finish the quadratic formula to find that. So remember, the quadratic formula is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of the discriminant, which we just found is 224, divided by 2 times a. So I'm going to substitute in x equals the opposite of b. B is negative 8, so I'll put positive 8, plus or minus the square root of 224 divided by 2 times a. Since a is 2, 2 times 2 is going to give us that we're going to divide by 4. And then we're going to go to our calculator to get our answer. So the first one, we're doing 8 plus the square root of 224. Make sure you hit your enter or equals, and then divide by 4. Rounding to 2 decimal places, we get 5.74. Now I'm going to do the same process, but I'm going to use 8 minus. Remember, use your minus, not your negative key there. And then I have to then divide by 4 and round that. And the other x-intercept is at a negative 1.74. And so there are our two intercepts for this one. All right, looking at this one, it's already set equal to 0. You don't have to put the x down if you don't need to, because in my head I already thought, do I need two numbers that multiply to negative 35 and add to 2? That's going to be a positive 7 and a negative 5. So remember that this just helps you organize your thoughts. Don't need to show it if you don't need it. This is our factored form here, and now we're going to set these equal to 0 and solve for our intercepts. So we have an intercept at negative 7, 0, and then we have an intercept at 5, 0. Immediately I can tell with this one that I'm not going to be able to do square root because I have the 10x there. If I think this through, two numbers that multiply to 12 and add to negative 10, if I think about 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4, I'm not going to be able to make a 10 out of that. So this does not factor. And so therefore, I am going to have to do the quadratic formula. So I'm going to say that the A value is 1, the B value is negative 10, the C value is 12. Negative 10 squared minus 4 times A times C is our discriminant. Let's go and put that in our calculator. So we'll have negative 10 squared. Make sure you put parentheses around that negative 10. Minus 4 times 1 times 12. That's going to give us a 52. This is our discriminant number. It is positive, so it tells us to continue because there are two solutions. So I'm going to do x equals the opposite of b. If my b is negative, the opposite is positive. Plus or minus the square root of 52. divided by 2 times a. Since a is 1, we're just going to divide by 2 there. And now I'm going to go to my calculator to get these two answers. So 10 plus the square root of 52. Hit equals or enter, divide it by 2, and then round to 2 decimal places, so 8.61. And now we're going to do 10 minus, remember use minus, not negative. And then remember that you still need to divide it by 2, round it to 2 decimal places, 1.39. And so there are our two solutions. All right, our next one, I know I can't do square root because it has the x term. If I try to think of, are there two numbers that multiply to 2 that add to -8? I know that that is not going to work. And so for this, then, I know that I've got to do quadratic formula. So a is 1, b is -8, c is 2. If I do b squared minus 4 times a times c, let me get that into my calculator. Make sure that you put that -8 into parentheses. Minus 4 times 1 times 2. Our discriminant number is 56. And so the positive discriminant number tells us to keep going, that we have two solutions. So I'm going to do x equals the opposite of b. Since b is -8, the opposite is +8. Plus or minus the square root of 56 divided by 2 times a. So a is 1, so we're just dividing by a 2. And then we're going to our calculator to get the answer here. So I'm going to be typing in 8 plus the square root of 56. And then make sure you hit equals or enter, divide by 2, round that to 2 decimal places. We should have 7.74. Now we're going to go do 8 minus the square root of 56. Make sure that you divide by 2. Round that to 2 decimal places, and that is going to be 0.29. And there are the two places where our parabola crosses over the x-axis. All right, so if we look at the next one here, we can definitely not do square root because it has that 3x there. You might, it's already set equal in standard form. You might want to take a minute to see if it does factor. We would know that 2x and x would have to be a given, but then I would have to look at this and say that I know that this is, because this is negative, I'm going to have one of these factors be a plus, one of these be a minus, and I need to be able to make a 3 in there. So I'm going to put the 5 times 1 here. If I put the -5 there and a positive there, what happens is when I multiply this, that gives me a -5x. When I multiply that, that gives me a 2x. That'll combine to make the -3x that we need. So I do have the correct factors, so this did factor. An alternative might be that if you don't want to spend the time to see if it factors, you could just go to quadratic formula. But if we take our factors and we set this equal to 0 and solve it, we can see that at 5/2 or at 2.5, 0, we have one solution, and then the other one is going to be at -1, 0. Okay. This one, when we look at it, it is set up already to do square root. It has that form. So I'm going to start by isolating the square, which means I have to move that -2. I can't distribute it in there because it has the parentheses have an exponent on the outside. So I think about how is the -2 connected to the parenthesis through what operation? That is multiplication. So I'm going to take and divide both sides by -2. That'll leave me with an x plus 3 squared equals 9. And now I'm going to take and square root both sides. I'm square rooting, so that's going to give me a plus or minus. The square root of 9 is 3. And then I'm going to move this positive 3 over to the other side. It's going to become negative 3. And then here are my two answers. One is negative 3 plus 3. So that's going to give me a 0. That tells me there is an intercept at the origin. And then the other one is negative 3 minus 3. And that tells me that there is an intercept at negative 6, 0. Here we have one that is set up for factoring. It's already set equal to 0. We can very easily look at this and say, what two numbers multiply to 20 and add to 9? That's 4 and 5. Those are our factors. We're looking to solve and find our intercepts though. So this will be at negative 4, 0. And this will be at negative 5, 0. When I look at this one, I know that I cannot do square root because it has the x term there. If I think about factoring, what two numbers multiply to a negative 1 that add to a positive 1, that is not going to factor. So therefore, I'm going to identify my A, my B, and my C, and go ahead and start to calculate the discriminant and do quadratic formula. And let me plug that into my calculator. So I've got 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times a negative 1. That's going to give us a discriminant number of 5, which is positive, tells us keep going. There's going to be two solutions. So I'm going to do x equals the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of the discriminant, divided by 2 times a. And now I'm going to go to my calculator to get my two answers. My first one, I'm going to put negative 1 plus the square root of 5. Make sure you hit enter or equal, and then divide it by 2. Rounding it to 2 decimal places is 0.62. And then if I calculate the other one, negative 1 minus the square root of 5, hit equals or enter, divide it by 2, round it to 2 decimal places, negative 1.62. Number 16, you have choices. You could either do square root or you could factor this. If we were going to do square root, we would take the 64 to the other side. We would divide by 16, isolate that square, and then square root both sides, and you would see that you would get plus or minus 2. Once again, you could have did that by factoring. You would get exactly the same answer. Okay. Number 17, cannot do square root because we see the x. It's your call if you want to try to factor first or go straight to quadratic formula. I do know this would have to be 2x and x. I know because this is a negative 5, that tells me I have to have one positive and one negative. And I don't think I'm going to be able to place the positive and negative in here so that I would be able to make a positive x. So as you look at that trial and error process, once you determine that you don't think that you can factor it, then you're going to abandon factoring, and we're going to go now and just do the quadratic formula. So this is kind of a judgment call on you. If you immediately just want to go to quadratic formula, you can, or you could spend a few seconds, see if it factors. If it does, it's usually quicker. If it doesn't, then you end up going to quadratic formula. So a is 2, b is 1, c is negative 5. We're going to do b squared minus 4 times a times c. To figure out the discriminant, let me get that in my calculator. So 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times a negative 5. It's going to give us 41. A positive discriminant tells us keep going, that we're going to have two solutions. So x equals the opposite of b. B is a positive 1. I'm going to put a negative 1. Plus or minus the square root of 41. And then divide by 2 times a. Since a is 2, 2 times a is going to be a 4. I'm then going to go to my calculator. and I'm going to type in that we have negative 1 plus the square root of 41. And then I'm going to divide that by 4 and round to 2 decimal places. So I'm going to have 1.35. And then I'm going to go and do negative 1 minus the square root of 41 and divide that by 4. And that is going to give us negative 1.85. Okay. Looking at number 18, I cannot do square root. It has an x term. If I think, are there two numbers that multiply to negative 18? That means one has to be positive, one has to be negative to make a positive 4. That would be 1 in 18, 2 times 9, or 3 times 6. I don't think that we can make a positive 4 with those, so I'm going to abandon that factoring works. And I'm just going to identify my A, my B, and my C. I'm going to calculate B squared minus 4 times A times C. So let me go to my calculator here. 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times a negative 18 is going to give us 88 as the discriminant. Positive discriminant tells us keep going. Look for those two solutions. X equals the opposite of B. B is 4, so I'm going to put a negative 4. Plus or minus the square root of 88 divided by 2 times A. So divided by 2 times 1 is going to be just dividing by 2 there. And so we're going to go to our calculator now. Do negative 4 plus the square root of 88. Hit enter, divide that by 2. Rounded to 2 decimal places, that's going to be 2.69. Now we're going to go and do negative 4 minus the square root of 88, and then divide that by 2. Rounded 2 decimal places, that's going to be a negative 6.69. All right, our next one here, you could decide if you want to try to do factoring. Cannot do square root because it's got the x term there. If you try to factor it, you would have to factor out a GCF of 2. And then you can see that you're still going to have to do trial and error. So I'm thinking that most people with this one would immediately just go to quadratic formula and identify your A, B, and C. And then we're going to calculate the discriminant. So we'll have negative 8 squared minus 4 times A times C. Let me put that into the calculator here. Okay, that is going to give us a discriminant of 32. Positive discriminant tells us keep going, find those two solutions. X equals the opposite of B. B is negative 8. The opposite would be positive 8. Plus or minus the square root of 32. Divided by 2 times A. A is 4, so we're going to be dividing by 8. We're ready to go to our calculator now. We're going to do 8 plus the square root of 32, and then divide by 8. Round that, we're going to have 1.71. Go back and do 8 minus the square root of 32, and divide that by 8. Rounding that, 0.29. And there are your two intercepts. All right, last problem is set up to do square root. So I'm going to subtract 30. How did I know that it was set up to do that? It's missing that x term, the linear term. It has only a square and constant values. And so I'm going to isolate the square. And then once the square is isolated, I'm going to square root. And then I need to make sure I put the plus or minus in there. And then the square root of 3 is going to be 1.73 when I round that to 2 decimal places. You may leave your answer like that, or you could say I have an intercept at 1.730 and negative 1.730.